Now, when Jesus heard this, our translation supplied the heard what, but what did Jesus hear that made him want to withdraw, to go off by himself in a boat to a quiet place? There had been this dinner party, you see. Herod, the acting king and ruler, was host. The feast was opulent as any dream a person might imagine. A royal dinner party with the most impressive guest list anyone could have. Great food, top-notch wine, and entertainment no one could equal. Anybody who was anybody was there, but not just anybody. Only those who were deemed important. Only those who counted as being in the upper echelons of Greco-Roman society. Those who by their presence would add prestige or power or a sense of grandeur to the king and the already lavish going-ons that took place that night at that dinner party. Anyway, the hour grew later and later, and the behavior of the king and the inner circle of the king's close guest list grew wilder and wilder. Herod asked his stepdaughter to dance, and she agreed in exchange for a gift. Having promised before the entire company of his guests to grant her whatever she desired, Herod, shocked and fearful of losing face, of being ashamed before these most important guests, found himself grieving at his own words when Salome, prompted by her mother Herodias, asked for the head of John the Baptizer on a platter. Violence so easily seeps in, especially when rulers, kings, and politicians are trying to impress each other with power, might, and extravagance. Herod's dinner party, his birthday party, has evolved, or rather devolved, into a web of debauchery and evil. Now John, friend, cousin, and predecessor to Jesus, lies slain, beheaded. A dinner party has devolved into violence and death. That's how it was in the world of Jesus. That's how it is even today, when we forget that the best way to live is the way that Jesus teaches. News of what's happened results in Jesus feeling the need to withdraw, to go off by himself for a while and seek solitude. But Jesus wasn't the only one who heard the news. When the masses of people heard what had happened, they went looking for Jesus. In their grief, they needed to be in the presence of Jesus, to hear his words and see what he would do. What action would he call for? In a hard, cold, cruel world, what do you do? Matthew, the narrator of our gospel, tells us when Jesus came ashore, he had compassion on them. He felt for them and cured their sick. In a hard, cold, cruel world, what are we called to do? Show compassion. The crowd that followed Jesus out into the wilderness, having heard the news of what happened at that flashy dinner party, probably were as filled with mixed motives as any one of us might be after hearing the down spiral of the evening news from D.C. As they wondered what Jesus might do, some wanted revenge and vengeance. Some wanted Jesus to issue a call to arms. Some wanted Herod's head on a platter. All such reactions we can understand. In a hard, cold world, violent means are often seen as necessary to quell violence. But, says Jesus, vengeance and violence are not God's way. If you would know God's way, break through to compassion. It is only compassion, God's compassion, born in us, that washes over and softens, that cleanses, renews, restores, and heals the burden of pain in this world and in the human heart. Seeing the crowd, Matthew tells us, while there is daylight, Jesus has compassion for them and cures their sick and teaches God's dream of an alternate way of living. Now it is evening. The day is far spent. The disciples come to Jesus and urge him, send the crowds away, so they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves. Jesus teaches by acting and acts by teaching. His disciples, though well-meaning, don't fully see things the way Jesus does. The crowds, numbed by the pain of the prior evening's dinner party, can't simply return to the hardness of that's the way it was, that's the way it is. They need connection. They need hope. They need to know that this isn't all there is or all there ever will be. They need to know God's way. And they need to know that they don't have to be resigned to heartless indifference. You give them something to eat, says Jesus. They do not need to go away. We have nothing here, the disciples reply. Nothing? Really? Only 5 loaves and 2 fish. It's barely enough for one person. Look at the crowds. Can't you see it's not enough? What are they among so many? The Gospel writer John says in another telling of this same story. The opulence of Herod's dinner party contrasts with the meager reality of this small amount of food in the wilderness. How do you see? What do you believe? Do you believe in the myth of scarcity or God's lyric of abundance? There is enough, says Jesus. Don't be anxious over what you will eat or drink or wear. Anxiety leads to hoarding and coveting and greed. When we are anxious, believing that there isn't enough, we see fear multiply. How we see, what we see, reveals what is possible. There is enough, says Jesus. Strive for God's realm and righteousness. Live in and under God's dominion or rule. All else will be added. But only 5 loaves and 2 fish? Bring them here to me. What God can do with what we willingly share is miraculous. What God does when we are willing to trust and open our hearts fills Jesus with an overflowing sense of gratitude and the regenerative, life-giving Holy Spirit. Ordering the crowd to sit down, we are told that Jesus, taking the food and looking up to heaven, blesses, breaks, and gives it to the disciples to share. They do as Jesus directs. And as they share, they let go of their preoccupations about not having enough. They experience God's compassion, mending broken hearts and minds, mending lives in the breaking of bread. An act of Holy Communion, a Eucharistic act, beginning with what is given as the food multiplies. We see today that what we share in Holy Communion has its beginnings not only in the meal that Jesus shares with his followers on the night when he was betrayed. We see that what we share Eucharistically is foreshadowed in this meal and all the meals that Jesus shares with outcasts and sinners. We acknowledge that the oneness of Jesus with the people numbed by the cruelty of a despotic ruler results in a sacramental gesture revealing the holiness of food from the earth and the holiness of the people who partake in it. And here, now, by this sign, the world is made different. All ate, all were satisfied. We regret that during this time of COVID-19, we are not able to partake of the Eucharist. We long for the feeding that Jesus gives. We look forward to that day when we can return in safety and know the satisfaction of the mending repair that comes to our lives, comes to our persons, comes to our hearts and minds as we partake of the food that Jesus offers. But we remember that now, in this feeding of body and soul, there is no coveting, no monopolizing, no greed, no hoarding. In this sign, by this meal, the world is made different. Generosity is amplified. The dreams of the many for a future when food will be good and plentiful is now with us. And now, more than 5,000 men, besides women and children, are fed. And there are 12 baskets, bread enough for all. 12 baskets left over. God's abundance overrides fearful anxiety. There is enough with God, with Jesus, with God's compassion. There is ample bread for all God's children.